I sent him an article that I read by Tom Campbell. Tom Campbell is a former, I think he's 5-term congressman from California. He's also a professor of economics. And he wrote a piece about the $3 trillion we've just added to the national debt in the last few months. And he says the money supply has increased by 24% over the last year, but real growth in the economy, by contrast, has been negative. And he ends this column this way, quote, "It gives politicians theoretic cover to do what they most like to do, cut taxes and spend money. It is unrealistic to suppose there will be some political will to raise taxes when inflation occurs tomorrow. I fear a substantial amount of inflation lies ahead of us, and no one is sounding the alarm." We're going to talk to our next guest about all of this. He is professor of economics from UCLA, Lee Ohanian. Professor, as always, thank you very much for taking the time. Now, you have been warning about inflation, and I think this guy, this professor of economics, Tom Campbell, pretty much sees the world the way you see it.
Yes, his piece was right on the money, Larry. There's people like Bernie Sanders and AOC have been, during press conferences when talking about programs like the Green New Deal, which are many, many, many $1 trillion of programs, people will ask them, well, how do you pay for this? And AOC has gone as far to say, well, we really have to get outside of the narrow-minded view that public spending has to be financed with taxes. Now, that was literally her verbatim quote, that we can just make things appear out of air. And it's this idea called modern monetary theory, which is the government can print money, and voila, fairy tale time, we can produce goods and services out of the government printing worthless paper money. So Campbell is right to be worried about inflation in the future. And within Congress, it's really hard to find anyone who is worried about how much inflation we might have, about the rising federal debt, about the upcoming difficulties we have with Medicare and with Social Security. So it's a real problem, and no one is talking about it. And Campbell is right on the money about that. So it is something we need to. It is something policymakers need to be discussing, but thus far it's just crickets.
Professor, is some of the blame on some of the experts, people like yourself? Because the predictions of the inflation haven't happened. And so I think a lot of people have now decided, well, these guys just didn't know what the hell they were talking about. We can do quantitative easing and we're not getting any inflation. So why should I listen to people like Lee Ohanian anymore?
So what happened 10 years ago is that the Fed provided a ton of liquidity, and most of it went into the banking sector, and it stayed there. So if you just look at the headlines, people think, wow, the money supply grew a lot, and we didn't have inflation. Now, we also didn't have that burst of growth that people thought quantitative easing would produce. What standard economic theory tells us is that once money gets into circulation and is being spent on goods and services, that's when inflation goes up. So I understand why people think, oh, yeah, we print a lot of money, and inflation didn't occur, so let's do it again. The precise reason why inflation didn't occur is because that money just sat in the banking sector, and it didn't get out in the system. What people like AOC and Bernie are talking about is literally printing money and not letting it sit in the banking system, but rather letting it be used to pay for contractors and engineers and steel and aluminum and all the stuff, the resources that are used to, say, produce the Green New Deal. And that would just be a complete disaster. And it is incredibly dangerous to think that inflation just will never appear no matter what you do. But that is the song that is being sung right now in a lot of quarters, including Bernie Sanders, AOC, and many, many other progressives.
My guest is Professor Lee Ohanian. He teaches economics at UCLA, author of many books and publications, including Macroeconomics, a Neoclassical Perspective. In this article, Professor, Tom Campbell predicts that inflation could get as high as 18.4% this year or soon thereafter.
Hard very hard to predict the short run aspects of inflation. I'm not trying to duck the question, but just empirically, it's really, really hard. And it's also really hard because once markets think the jig is up, then inflation can just take off. You take a look at Greece a few years ago. Everything was fine, and then one day, boom. One day, interest rates on Greek debt just skyrocketed. Why is that? Because markets knew. Markets got to the point where they understood that the ability and the will of the Greek government to honor their obligations had been surpassed. So once that point happens, inflation can be 20, 30, 40, 50%. It's very hard to know when that point comes. I don't think we're close to the United States, but it is absolutely ridiculous to think that that never will happen, no matter how much debt we create. And the United States is still the most credit-worthy government among all Western democracies, but every single one has a limit. They all have a limit, and when that limit is reached, interest rates skyrocket. Suddenly a government is saying, we can't pay the debt off. And then interest rates rise more, and then the government defaults. And the only way they can make the books balance is by simply just printing money. We've seen that happen hundreds of times in the history of the world, including, a few years ago in places like Argentina and Brazil.
20 seconds, Professor.
Yeah, we've seen that happen just hundreds of times. And I have no idea what people think when they say, oh, it'll never happen here, it'll never happen here. It is just the most dangerous economic discussion I've seen in a long, long time. So I hope policymakers come to their senses about this.
Professor of Economics at UCLA, Lee Ohanian. Professor, as always, thank you very much for taking the time. We appreciate it.
Thank you, Larry.